Hi, everyone. Thanks to all you who have stayed through the entire conference. We really appreciate it. So this is the final panel of our Technology and Development Conference. And we're going to shift focus a bit. Unlike Jason's great keynote address and the panel before him, we're not going to be focusing on the future of work per se. We're going to be talking about this issue of data governance, this evolving issue of data governance. And of course, there's some overlap, right? The rising share of jobs that are tied to digital services, and this growing consensus. There's growing consensus that in order for digital services to provide, I would say, a healthy engine of growth and job creation, that there needs to be rules in place to govern the use, the sharing, and the collecting of data, and particularly personal data. So that's where our focus is going to be in this discussion. And although this comes at the end of our conference, this panel also is kind of a marker of a beginning for CGD, because we're kicking off a 2-year research program with generous support from the Hewlett Foundation on this issue of how do we support balanced data governance? How do we support policymakers, or how can policymakers and the development community put in place policies that reap the benefits of expanded use of digital services while also protecting against the misuse of data? And the research we conduct is going to be guided by a working group that we're kind of in the midst of putting together right now. It's going to consist of experts from development, technology, and privacy. And I'm happy that we have two of our co-chairs of the group here today, Pam Dixon, who I'll introduce you more formally later, and Ben Adulu. And since we're just launching this research program, I'm in the happy position of not having to worry about my state of ignorance on this, because we're very much in a learning mode, and I feel comfortable asking questions that may be rather basic. But that's why I'm very happy to have this panel here on stage, because we have 4 people with deep expertise, strong opinions, and they each kind of come at this issue of data governance from a different perspective and with a different lens. And they're all very nice people as well, so I think it's a good mix for a good discussion. For that reason, I'm just going to start with intros, and we'll get moving. I'll start at the end. Pam Dixon is the founder and executive director of the World Privacy Forum, which is a nonprofit organization that conducts in-depth research, analysis, and consumer education on issues related to data privacy. She also recently served as the rapporteur of the first roundtable of African data protection authorities, and I'll ask her about her experiences there later. Benno Ndulu is the academic director of the Pathways for Prosperity Commission, based at Oxford University's Blavatnik School. Earlier, he served as the governor of the Central Bank of Tanzania, where he oversaw the country's financial inclusion efforts, including by introducing agent banking and supporting growth in mobile financial services. Dhanaraj Thakur is the research director of the World Wide Web Foundation. Over the last 10 years, he's led research projects on broadband affordability, gender inequality online, and data rights, all with a focus on low and middle income countries. And finally, Priya Vora is the chief executive officer of Future State, which is a nonprofit initiative within the United Nations Foundation that advises governments and development agencies on digital policy and data empowerment. And she's also the former director of the Center for Digital Development at USAID. So the format is, I'm hoping that we can have a nice flowing discussion. I also want to leave at least 40 minutes for questions and answers, because I can just look out at the audience and I see people with strong opinions themselves on these issues, and I want to hear from them. But the format is going to be the first round of questions. I'm going to ask everyone the same question. And then the second and third round, if we make it to the third round of questions, I'm going to target questions to each specific panelist and then ask the panelists to kind of weigh in beyond that. And because I'm pretty confident we're going to have a very interesting discussion, I feel comfortable asking what is possibly a very boring definitional question to start. And I'll start with you, Priya, and then we'll go down the line. And that is, when you hear the words data governance, what do you think that actually means? Because I think it's still a rather open concept that people are kind of figuring out the boundaries of. What do you think it means? Does it meaningfully capture a distinct set of issues? And most importantly, for people in this room and maybe the development community more broadly, why should we care about data governance? So I'll start with you, Priya.
Okay, I assume this is a little bit lightning round, so I'll be quick here. So first of all, thanks for having me, and more importantly, for even having a panel on this discussion. You know, it's I hope in a year from now we have many more such discussions, and by then you'll have come up with the definition of data governance that we can all agree on. So in the meantime, I think our working definition at Future State is that data governance really means the set of policies, the institutions, and the technology systems for how national data assets get managed, get collected, used, shared, stored. And the key part in that is that it's far beyond data protection legislation. The institutions and the technology systems really are what make or break the whole situation, right? You can give people rights to manage their own data or portability of data, but if the institutions for overseeing that or the systems for enabling that don't exist, it's not really meaningful. So that's our working definition. I think more importantly, what we're trying to figure out is what are we striving for when we're talking about data governance. And for us, the goals of a data governance paradigm are to make sure that more people participate in the data economy, that people have agency over their data, that there is a market of competition and choice for people, and that fundamentally there's trust in how data is used. And that pact framework is really, in our mind, the North Star.
Great, thanks. Dhanaraj.
Yes, thanks, Mike, and thanks, everyone. I feel like when you structure it like this, each of us adds a bit more piece of complexity to the answer. So maybe I'll go ahead and do that. I agree what you've said, that for us it's also about these institutions, policies, and rules that deal with the management of data. For us, what's really key is to base this on like a human rights perspective. So we're talking about human agency and protecting and promoting people's rights. I feel like the process that we are going through now also involves this kind of tension around, if you look at personal data, for example, trying to find the right balance between meeting local contextual needs when it comes to, say, personal data. For example, the extent to which people might adopt or apply the GDPR. More and more people are thinking of the G and the GDPR as global now and not necessarily general, right? And that balancing that with the interoperability needs. So we talk about data governance, right? But we have to think of it in an international scale as well. The extent to which people's rights, people can expect their rights to be protected across different borders, as well as, say, companies who might want to have some kind of uniformity, especially if they work across regions and governments. So I think that kind of tension is there as in addition to this kind of definition of what we think of data governance is.
Great. Benno.
Yeah, when I think about data governance from a policy perspective, it's balancing between innovation for development, privacy, and security, being aware that there are important trade-offs across these three. At a level of development which is fairly low, typically when we did consultations across countries, development comes at the top, and you get second or third priorities on the other two. But still, it is important, I think, from a policy perspective to make sure that one manages the risk of either over-regulating or under-regulating data, since it is an intangible asset now, which is a big part of the economy. And it is important that one doesn't kill development in favor of simply guaranteeing privacy and security. So we are much more in that space of balancing trade-offs.
Great. Pam.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your kind invitation to be here and also be co-chair. It's a pleasure. So I have a bit of a different answer. So I see people in this room whom I've had the great pleasure of working with, and I think you'll be able to predict somewhat what I'm going to say. So I've been working in data governance for about 25 years. So I have a much longer time in this field already. So we actually, I think data governance is certainly a part of the question, but actually we really like to think of it now as knowledge governance, because what we're really trying to do is govern the knowledge that's created from data. It's not just about the data, it's about the knowledge, the actionable knowledge that can come from data. When you really think about how it's used in economies. In regards to contextualizing this, and as well as understanding the structure of how this works, there are some very good frameworks that already exist in data governance and also in knowledge governance. And the way I like to think of it is I call it the messy middle. A spigot for data use without considering risk mitigation or complexities is an issue. The spigot that says it's all protection based on human rights principles is also a problem. And again, we come back to the messy middle. And I think that what is extraordinarily important is to think in terms of systems. If we're going to think about data governance, which I prefer to think of as knowledge governance, we must think in systems and employ systems thinking. And let me give you an example of this. I think identity systems have been touched on a bit today. When you think about an identity ecosystem, you have to think of the 30 or so ecosystems that are part of that identity ecosystem. You have to think of the multinational companies and laws, the micro-identity ecosystems. And then the identity ecosystems are subsets of larger government record systems, and so on and so forth. And then those country-level systems are part of the larger global data ecosystems. And so if you start to really map out the data systems that are in place, all of a sudden, you get to see how the information, the knowledge, is interacting at a very global and rapid scale. And then you can start to think about, okay, how are we going to put some rules in place? Do we have global rules sometimes? Yeah. Do we have contextual rules sometimes that are very, very discrete and localized? Absolutely, because context is everything when it comes to this type of governance. Do we have institution-based rules? Yes. So it's yes and. It's not no, but it's yes and. So governance gets complex, but there are very good systems available to handle that complexity. But I think the most important thing to remember is that what we're really trying to achieve is responsible use of information and knowledge. And if we can achieve that by mitigating risks and by establishing good practices, I think that goes a very, very long way, and it's completely doable.
Thanks, Pam. So it seems like everyone was kind of building on a bit of a pivot by Pam at the end, and I think all the issues that each of you brought up, we're going to be touching on through the next round of questions. So I'm happy that I feel good about the questions I have here, because we're going to dive into some of these issues. But I want to start with one that we didn't really talk about, and I think any discussion about data governance worth its salt today has to kind of discuss this idea of data as oil, right? The metaphor that a lot of ink has been spilled, excuse the pun. Wow, that fell flat. A lot of ink has been spilled on this idea that this is a rather strained metaphor, right? But it's an idea that's touched a nerve among policymakers, and is also it has staying power. And so I think I'll start with you, Pam. We're going to kind of go this way with the next round of questions, because I know you have very strong ideas about this issue, particularly not just data as oil, but the idea of data as something that individuals should have property rights around. Wow. So why don't we start there? So
first off, I believe trust is the new oil. I just gave a speech about this. Really, trust is the new oil. Data is a component of what gets transacted in the trust, but trust is the new oil. In terms of, if you look at the general architectures of very broad level governance, you have command and control, which is, for example, the GDPR. Then you have ownership structures, and then you can have self-governance or adaptive governance structures. And pretty much most of the human systems we make can fit into those general categories. Ownership of data, we went down this path about 20 years ago, and we found very unexpected results. So we've done a lot of studies. There's a lot of scholarly work in this area, and I can tell you that it tends to not end well. particularly in the privacy context. Look, there have been a remarkable number of studies and actual unfortunate real world situations where people have been paid for their data. So it becomes a bit unfortunate where someone for 15 cents is paid for their life data, and then that's it. There is no return on that investment for them, whereas the folks who are purchasing that data make lots and lots of money over time. So I do think that as data ownership is a very, very difficult concept, and I think there are many, many more productive and more balanced ways of approaching it that lead to a greater outcome that is more sustainable.
So maybe I'll push you on that, and then also ask other panels to touch on what are the better frames
Yes.
to approach these.
And to just add a little point to the data ownership, one of the deep problems in this is that if you have a common pool data, so for example, how about a social media platform? Who owns that data? Who owns your financial data? Do you own your financial data? I mean, the data ownership problem becomes quite difficult in an increasing world of common pool, ownership situations. Which brings me to a much more of an adaptive framework where data and knowledge is governed in a mutual fashion that is agreed upon. So for example, standard setting is very helpful. Adaptive work such as Eleanor Ostrom's principles of governance are very helpful in the data context, although they have to be adapted, we've found. I think these are helpful. I think some command and control structures are also helpful. It depends on the context and the jurisdiction. GDPR has come up a couple of times. You know, GDPR, in a lot of the development contexts, GDPR has had to be rewritten so that it's actually implementable. As it is written, it is a very beautiful piece of legislation, but extraordinarily difficult to implement on the ground. And so people have had to rewrite it for their own jurisdictions. And that rewriting for their own jurisdictions, that's where all the power is. And I think that's really where if you want to call it governance, that's where the governance really is. So it's a blend, a beautiful, messy blend of all of those things. No silver bullets.
Does anyone else in the panel want to comment on this, the idea of data ownership versus maybe a rights approach or different approaches of thinking about data empowerment?
I will.
Okay.
So I agree. I mean, the analogy is fraught and I think overused. But I think there's, a couple of things to acknowledge. One is there's a real concern that that without kind of rules and institutions in place to govern data, there's just a bunch of risks that countries are suddenly exposed to, whether that's risks of the value of data being accrued to big companies in China or the US, or whether it's privacy breaches or whatever. So there's even though it's a fraud analogy, it's one that's sticking around because there's this kind of sense that data is worth something and needs to be figured out, and if you don't, there are a lot of downside risks. So I think in that sense, it's good to kind of jump on the bandwagon and start figuring out what is an appropriate model of data governance that is implementable. I don't know kind of the, I like this idea of mutuality. Most data is generated by at least two parties, me with Facebook or me with my bank or credit card or, vendor or whatever. And I think there are lots of not lots, but there are some examples like Estonia or like India who acknowledge, yes, Facebook should have rights over the data and to analyze my behavior because I'm using them, but I too should be able to access my own data and port it and go somewhere else. So in that sense, we tend to like the analogy that data is more like a vote, and you should be able to have, cast a vote and share your data with a provider that you trust. And that isn't necessarily something you sell, but it is an asset, an intangible asset that you can exercise your preferences with.
May I jump in quickly? Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think the value of data lies in its use. It's not just because data exists. And we know that from a development perspective, its application is what generates value, and not necessarily just sitting with it as a stock. So I think it is very important to look at the exercise of rights in the market for rights, if you want, because you cannot simply just hold on onto that particular asset if it doesn't have value. So I think data portability and ownership are all quite important questions. But ultimately, we have to look at the trade-off in terms of what's the format of use. So for example, data now is very helpful in developing learning systems to improve delivery of education, learning results, health results. And you do that only if you allow that flow of information to be exercised or be used in the process of the whole system. So individual versus system has to be one of the questions too that we need to grapple with in terms of this. Yeah.
May I jump in?
Sure.
I agree. And, you know, the idea of mutuality is extraordinarily important. And yes, I agree completely. You know, one of the frustrations right now in privacy is that, you know, all of the privacy gets pushed into a privacy policy at the very end of the day. So at the end of the day, we're supposed to tick a box or check a box, right? And say, we've read and agree with privacy policy. Well, this is not real agency. I'll tell you, real agency is having a seat at the table to determine the general usage of the data. Imagine how different our world would be if Facebook invited us or a group of meaningful stakeholders represented as well by normal, everyday Joe and Jane consumers to say, here's how we do and do not want our data used. Here's what we have to say about it. Imagine if we had a seat at the table. It would be so different. And I think that is a much more meaningful framework of mutuality.
I just add to that. I also think the issue of consent around these around these services is problematic, and feel like we have a long way to go in terms of figuring out mechanisms that allow meaningful consent, so that people can understand what actually what risks are involved with regard to privacy or their data that's being, you know, when they apply for these services. But to go back to your first question, Mike, on the data, all things, I agree. I think most of us see this as flawed. And in my mind, what's really important are the underlying rights here. What kinds of rights are involved, whether it's rights to access, redress, data portability, things like that. To what extent does the end user have or can leverage those rights when it comes to these kinds of transactions around data? That I think is a better focus as opposed to the ownership question.
Yeah. And you know, going back to these ideas, you mentioned the idea of data flows and making sure data is usable. I think, you know, in going to your issue of principles and rights, you know, I think general principles and rights are fine. And also data use is fine. But the way to kind of get the balance right is to make sure that there are a number of laws that do something called routine uses. And those of you who are familiar with the Privacy Act of 1974 will know exactly what I'm talking about. There is a general agreed upon use of data that's okay. But anything beyond that is consented and requires consent. But it's only a really meaningful uses that are unexpected and have, you know, more significant consequences. But when you look at, for example, machine learning or AI data ecosystems, which are just extraordinarily complex and to some degree opaque, it's really not possible to consent to everything anymore. The systems have become too complex. And given the fact that we cannot consent to everything, we then have to have ways of having a seat at the table, ways of ensuring that there's fair data uses, but we can't control it anymore. It's out of our control, so we need better rules.
Well, and maybe a whole new set of organizations that, I have a financial manager to help me make sense of what's going on in the market. Is there some sort of equivalent on, an organization that can take my preferences around data and help me make sure that I'm only working with those organizations or those companies that are using data accordingly?
Or making sure that those companies have good rules in place
Right.
themselves and can
Right.
become trusted companies.
Yeah,
So we can demonstrate trust or have proof of trust, et cetera, yeah.
I think this gets back to what I was trying to say in the first question. Then, your laws are just one piece of the pie. You really need to, think creatively around the institutional capability, whether that's self-regulation or new government bodies or, fiduciaries or whatever it is that kind of really give meaning to data governance strategy.
So Donrod, since you brought up work on digital rights and the Web Foundation is kind of at the forefront of working on the issue of digital equality, including a focus on gender and women's rights over the last few years. So what are some of the main observations you've made from that experience, and how is the issue of gender relevant to data governance?
Yes, I think it's very relevant. We have been doing a lot of work on internet access as well as use from a gender frame over the last couple of years. When we think of data, I'd argue that we have certain gender gaps that exist right now. So for example, Pam, you mentioned like AI systems that's meant to support government decision making. I think there was an article in The Guardian recently, the Guardian newspaper in the UK recently, that many governments in the world are incorporating AI systems to support their welfare programs. One of the problems with AI and machine learning systems is the data sets that they have, and if they are not representing the population in general, then you're going to come up with flawed outcomes. And when we think about data sets generally, especially in low and middle income countries, they're drawn from people's online activities. The problem there is we know that there's a gender gap in terms of use. Men are more likely to use the internet and be online than women. And so now you have data sets that are not representative, are not gender equal in that sense. At the same time, when you talk about how people can use their data or use public data sets or open data sets, government data, there's also a gap there because of issues around the existing wage gap, skills, patriarchal systems, all of which can limit the extent that women can actually leverage these kinds of data. So you have different kinds of gaps that exist. That on top of current patterns where there's online discrimination and bias, harassment, and so on, particularly against women. All these things come together to reflect kind of inequality that we should be aware of when we talk about data governance. If data governance is good public policy is about ensuring equal outcomes for everyone, then we cannot develop good data governance policies if we assume that these things are going to be gender neutral, because we have to acknowledge that everyone is coming from different standpoints, and particularly in many countries, there are patriarchal systems that hold women back. So I would argue that data governance, good data governance policies should be gender responsive, should be aware of these kinds of differential outcomes on men and women. And that's what, when we think about internet access and use, that's the approach we've made. I would translate that to this kind of emergent discourse as well.
I would add just one quick thing to add to what you've said. You know, one of the problems that we've had in the global south in particular, is when we go into a jurisdiction to do research and to try to find baselines for comparison, one of the problems we've had is we do not find gender disaggregated statistics. And where there are not gender disaggregated statistics, I mean, so let's say that there is a jurisdiction where there are honor killings, and let's say that there were 200 honor killings per year. Well, how many of those honor killings were women and how many were men? Because that response will change the interpretation of that data. So I agree wholeheartedly that it is quite important to consider like where these gaps are. There's also certain gaps around children and the elderly that are very significant and quite difficult to manage.
So Ben, I want to turn to you now for a question about policymaker perspectives, because you've worked closely with governments that are kind of trying to build foundational systems related to digital ID and mobile digital financial services. So these systems can make government services more effective and efficient and possibly even more transparent, but they generate a lot of data data that can be tied to individuals that also represents sometimes possibly a liability. So when you think about this question, how can governments use citizen data to kind of maximize good while mitigating against those risks? And then I guess the add-on question is, the countries you're talking with most frequently, do you think that capacity exists yet, and the expertise exists, and the guidance?
Yeah, I think the starting point has to be a social license that the government should get, which balances expectations of the population in terms of transparency and privacy with the development objectives that it wants to promote. So one has to start with a good sense of where are the preferences within the society on this. It is very often unfortunate that preferences are typically imposed on a country on the basis of whatever that one has learned from the context of where research was done. And therefore, I think an assessment process in country with most of the stakeholders present would be an extremely important starting point. And that should give the government first a sense of where they should draw lines in terms of use of data and information that is gathered. I think second, in that same conversation is to realize that data when used in a system is the data that generates results. It's not necessarily purely individually applied. So I gave the example of education systems and health systems. So for example, if you adopt individualized teaching on the basis of data that has been collected, knowing exactly the strengths and weaknesses of those that you teach, you get much more effective learning outcomes. But that requires that you actually make your data available for purposes of being able to make that type of application. There are a number of pilots in the health sector of similar nature. So that information is being collected now at much lower cost and is getting bigger and bigger just because there are more and more people that are using these type of online services. So I think the capacity of the government to organize that information and be able to apply the right artificial intelligence or other methodologies in order to get the right results is extremely important. And I would underline also the importance of data portability, particularly in terms of not just having these basic foundational systems, which are ID, payments, and e-government, but to be able to have these systems that speak to each other and reduce the cost of application of information across systems by reducing the barriers of access. So I think, as I said at the beginning, it's an important balancing act between those aspects of privacy and security and protecting those rights versus, getting development results when they are actually applied properly. So proportionality ultimately is quite important in application of standards. Unfortunately, standards are now being developed in a very different context and being applied at levels where these trade-offs would produce very different results. So it is, I think, important, just like proportionality in anti-money laundering and related standards have also to apply in this respect.
So a risk-based approach is kind of it. So I want to
Can I
return.
maybe
Okay, we've got
respectfully
people teed up. Go
partly
ahead.
disagree.
And then down
Is
around.
that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just ask,
So-
if as you're answering, we've laid out the term data portability, but not defined it yet, and I'm conscious that some of us are coming from different backgrounds. So maybe, and I know you've worked in it, maybe within your answer, talk about what data portability means.
Yeah, although
Sorry,
I'm
I
not
shouldn't-
quite going to
okay.
touch on that. So I agree that trust is highly contextual, and if there's a country where there's high trust in government, then there might be more appetite to share data with government and have it be more useful for a variety of purposes. And there might be contexts where it's less so and there's more of a preference towards privacy. I think that no matter where you fall in that spectrum, it's hard to argue against systems and tools that give people insight and transparency to how their data is used. Because no matter what that agreement is today, what we need is for people to have a better sense of how their data is being used tomorrow so they can hold government accountable, so they can hold companies accountable. And right now, all these things are being done, we're all in the dark. And so I think there's one piece of this which has to be kind of uniform, which is people's rights and the tools for transparency that give them more agency. And I think within that, then there might be more or less appetite for handing over data.
And I would just,
Let me just do Dhanraj and then I'll turn.
Yes, so I agree with that. In fact, what I was saying at the start was that, or I was implying is that we don't want a situation where people are benefiting from a higher level of rights, a higher standard of rights in one jurisdiction as opposed to other, which might be what's playing out now. For example, the way Facebook might negotiate with GDPR for Europeans as opposed to how they might play out for other countries. To go back to Ben's point about the implementation or what's happening on the ground, I just want to raise one quick example of some research we just released around data protection implementation in Indonesia, or the challenges around that. And yes, the issues around capacity building come about, as well as this kind of scattered perception among the people we spoke to about who is actually responsible here. So this is an institutional problem that even within the government, it's not clear who is in charge of, say, data protection. But then tied to that is the population itself. One problem that we saw emerge is in terms of, say, access to credit for a woman who would not otherwise be able to access that because their husbands might get in the way, for example. They are able to use mobile apps that provide credit. So now they have access to credit where they didn't have it before. The problem is these applications are very risky in terms of privacy. But for them, they're willing to, for them, the benefit of access to credit outweighs the risks that are presented to them in private. So when people are with the people we spoke to are talking about introducing better, stronger data protection regulations in that country that would apply to these people, these women, they are hesitant because for them, they're thinking that this is going to threaten their access to credit. So just to add to that complexity about how people themselves, apart from government, might react to these issues as well.
and I'm going to pile on with a slightly different take. So there are, in terms of architectures of data and knowledge governance, there is a particular model that introduces profound risk, which is the centralized model, where all the data is really held by the government in a centralized transactional database, and the services are added and hung off of that centralized transactional database. So this is the Aadhaar model. And the Aadhaar model, I do think, grew to very difficult proportions and had a lot of serious consequences. I think the Supreme Court ruling, the Aadhaar decision, got it right, where the Aadhaar is continuing, but there are new protections being added to how the data is being held and used and stored and whatnot. In the newer systems that are being built today, it's hard to think of Aadhaar as being already 10 years old, but in the newer systems that are being built today, you have a centralized registry. However, it's immediately used for deduplication only, and then that data is hashed. And then the last mile for services is quote unquote tokenized, so that the transactions occur with privacy protections in place. You get to use the data, but you're not introducing such extraordinary human rights and privacy risks. So you get the use, and you've mitigated the risks. So I think a lot of this is looking at the system and then saying, okay, let's do a trust analysis of that system. Can this system be trusted by the people it is purporting to help and being designed to help? Let's do a very detailed, in-depth risk analysis of the system and figure out what can be mitigated. If something cannot be mitigated, then that goes into the high-risk category, and you might not be able to do it. Then you can do, finally, in the final outcome, you can do a privacy impact analysis, and you can do all of this before a single shred of data runs through beyond a pilot. So I do think that we have to take great care in mapping the data, mapping who can use the data for how long, and what general controls are there on that data, so that the transparency and human agency is retained.
Great. So Priya, I'm going to put you on the spot. I know that Future State is working with the World Bank, doing a report that kind of looks at how that institution deals with its client countries in terms of investment and technical capacity building related to the supporting sound data governance. I know you're probably not even done with the research. You're not publishing the report till maybe spring?
I hope.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. But can I ask you, are there any takeaways, any lessons learned yet that speak to how the development community should be engaging with policymakers on these issues?
Well, I first want to acknowledge Mary in the room here, so she can also weigh in. I think what's been important to recognize in this work with the World Bank, but also other development agencies, is that we've been pushing the digitization agenda for so many years, investing in digital IDs and digital payment systems and e-health systems and e-government, and with very little attention to what happens with the resultant data. So I think the World Bank, even by saying that they want to look more deeply into issues of data governance, is ahead of the game, frankly, and they're acknowledging that we need to care, because data is a powerful tool, or the insights generated from data can either be used for better government services, for empowering people, for promoting competitive markets, or it can be used for surveillance, manipulation, control, and lead to monopolies and stifle innovation. So, it really does matter, and I think that's kind of the top line thing that we're kind of all agreeing to in this engagement. I think the harder thing to figure out is, what is it that the development community from afar can say and do to support governments. And I think, one thing that's really clear is, shopping around GDPR and saying, here, this is what you should institute is probably bad practice. And it's not implementable. And even if it is considered global DPR, it's just not practical. So there really does have to be much more thought. And frankly, we are really proposing that there be far more investment in capacity building and kind of exercising the muscle of responsive regulation, because the issues of tomorrow are going to be different from those today. And if we can make sure that through more peer networks and using kind of innovative tools like sandboxing, we can kind of help support governments as they're learning and adjusting.
So am I right in thinking like the locus of policymaking within different governments on this issue of data governance is different? Do the World Bank and other institutions have to be, who are they talking to within countries?
It's a huge question. The CIO office within a Ministry of Health is almost always bigger than the national CIO's office. So you have the health and the banking sectors, which have kind of outsized influence on how data is going to be managed, and they have specialized kind of needs in both of those sectors. You also have increasing You're seeing more data protection authorities of limited, or variable effectiveness, I would say. You have these digital teams often reporting to government. So it's really, I think that's a huge question, is who's setting the agenda, and and how are you taking into account the kind of special needs of different sectors? I'd be interested in others' thoughts on this.
I think in the limited number of pilots that we have been doing in the context of the Pathways Commission, it is very clear that you have got to locate this type of work either at the prime ministerial level or at the presidential level, in order to make sure that it doesn't become sort of a silo-oriented initiative. So, for example, automatically most ministries in charge of innovation and communication and technology always give themselves the mandate as the leader in managing these issues. But typically, they only look at the technical front, the infrastructure-related issues, and they think that's the way it should be. But we are talking about application of technology throughout the economy, and it has to be a much larger undertaking than simply putting it under any one of those. And not only that, I think the second lesson that we are learning is that you need to have a multi-stakeholder process in getting at whatever ultimate sort of game plan the country has to follow. It can't just be a government issue. Policy is not always just government. So, and it is very important to have all the key players, the market participants, also as part of that process. And investing in that process is as important, I think, as investing in the nuts and bolts of this. Yeah.
Pam?
Yes, so I do think that it's absolutely critical to have a very robust multi-stakeholder process. It really cannot be done without that. And you've got to have it be a due process, multi-stakeholder process, where there's real fairness and non-dominance of any particular stakeholder. And that's very difficult to achieve, but it is possible if you have a good constitution for whatever multi-stakeholder process that is. That being said, I do think that the data protection authorities have a very special place. Next week, it changes location each year, but next week is the convening of the International Data Protection Conference in Tirana. And I believe there's 1,200 data protection authorities who will attend. And each jurisdiction has a slightly different law, a slightly different rule, but the DPAs are really charged with knowing the law, understanding data. Some of them, particularly in the Global South, are quite new, and not all jurisdictions have a DPA. But those jurisdictions that do have a DPA, in general, have a huge resource to assist both government as well as business and consumers. And that really is their remit, to really tie together all of the parts. So I think they're a very important stakeholder as well.
But can I ask, because I read the readout of the Roundtable for African Data Protection Authorities, it seemed like some of these authorities lacked authority within their countries.
The truth is, here is the truth of the world. You can have law on the books, but the law is really about, you will, at the end of the day, still have to get buy-in for whatever you're doing. And the DPAs will have to get buy-in. You can have all the authority in the world, but you're going to have to get buy-in. We see this in almost all jurisdictions, and that buy-in is the multi-stakeholder process.
But if the top doesn't buy in, I can assure you,
Yeah.
whatever DPA.
That's right. You have to get buy-in.
I would say, and in addition to the top, I feel like in low and middle income countries, a major sector or group of players is the telecoms industry. There's a lot, when we talk about data protection, especially here, you think of Facebook and Google, but the telecoms industry is huge because think about it, everything you're doing online is going through them, right? I feel like, and I've been to many telecoms industry kind of meetings where this issue hardly ever comes up because for them, particularly in low-income countries, it's about, they think data is completely different in terms of a revenue source, as in over-the-top services like YouTube and WhatsApp and so on. So the perspective is very different. So getting buy-in from that particular group, I think, would be very important, in addition to like at the top and so on.
You know what's so intriguing is that in the several jurisdictions in Africa, the DPAs are actually part of the telecom ministries, which is a huge conflict of interest. But nevertheless, you know what's happened though is that they've had to engage with each other and they've been learning from each other. So it's a very long, slow road, but it's very, very interesting.
So I'm keen to turn to the audience. I want to ask one last question because we've talked about GDPR, and you all kind of shook your head. But I mean, the reality is a lot of these conversations are happening because of the GDPR, I think. I mean, there are developments on the ground that have happened that we've raised our level of concern, but I think GDPR is kind of forcing the conversation on certain countries. And you all seem to be in agreement that that type of approach just is not a fit for the low and lower middle income countries we're talking about. And I just want to get a very quick sense of why that's the case.
Okay. The GDPR was written in Europe by Europeans, largely,
Right.
for
Thank you, Pam.
a highly developed context with a lot of extraterritorial applicability. And it just did not contemplate the entirety of all economies. It just did not. And that therefore lies the problem. So there are certain. So let me give you one specific example. There is a requirement for something called technological proof of compliance with the law. Well, in order to do that, most companies have spent upwards of $1 billion for multinationals. For local companies, they've spent several $million. Typically, the numbers vary depending on what country you're talking about. But for a country to prove, for a single like SME or even larger company to prove technical compliance, they have to literally map every data point within their company and then express technically how that's working. This is a really big ask in many jurisdictions. It's expensive to do, and you'd have to map it. You'd have to pay for the technology, and so on and so forth. That's just one teeny example. There are so many more. So it needs to be adapted. I think the principles can really work. I really love what the jurisdiction of Mauritius has done. I think they have an extraordinary adaptation of GDPR. It's short, it works for their jurisdiction, and it was brilliant, really.
Great. So with that, I think I'd like to turn to the audience for questions. Got first hand here, second hand there, and anyone else? Yeah. Sorry, we'll wait for the microphone.
I am Davide Stosani from the World Bank as well, and you are mentioning, Michael, the piece of work that is just started. I wanted to enter a slightly different perspective. So I'm from the private sector arm of the World Bank, and one of the issues you mentioned at the start, definition of data governance, that is actually quite a critical point, because I think we see a potentially interesting boundary between data governance and data partnership, something that shouldn't really be discounted off at the start. But I wanted to ask you a slightly different question. So one of the issues that we're facing in understanding the limits of data governance is that as we work every day with private sector, one of the things that we're trying to do is to convince some of these digital platforms to actually enter markets that they consider way too complex. Typically what we do is we have somebody in Kenya or in Nigeria, and we are really praying for them to actually enter Sierra Leone or some of these other difficult markets. And we fear that excessive regulation on data may be an additional hurdle to that. So we want to make sure that the approach is balanced, especially as we prepare to advise governments in, and it's not just a binary, I'm entering, I'm not entering the market, which we have seen, it does happen. There are companies that have decided not to enter markets just because of data regulation. It's also because we're seeing that going back to the partnership point, that there is an opportunity with private sector. The data that they create can also be used for the greater good, if you want. And so we want to make sure that regulation does not distort incentives for companies to actually think of smart ways of using the data. And it is happening, and the telecom operators are doing that. And I was wondering if you had thought about this trade-off as of whether there is perhaps a staged approach to regulation depending on the maturity of the countries, because we see this as one of the key issues that we need to grapple with to make sure that the primary objective, which is to actually turbocharge the digital economy, actually gets realized. Ultimately, there's no point regulating data if there's no data to start with. So this is really a question that we need to sort of face in the next few months.
So maybe we'll take a handful, 2 or 3. We have one in the back and then Caroline up front, and then we'll.
Yeah, hi, thank you. My question is, what technologies, policies, or institutions do you see as showing promise or potential when it comes to positive impact for data governance? So put differently, where should we be doubling down our efforts to do right by this term that we're still trying to define, but that we know is extremely important? So
That's a great question.
Thanks very much, and thanks to all of you. I wanted to sort of follow on a bit from this point about how to avoid excessive regulation, and I think that was a little bit what Benno was talking about, the trade-offs for development, and to put sort of 2 different questions really to the panel. One is we've kind of said, well, the data, what is the data value, or what's a good analogy? Maybe it's not the oil. Another one that has been used a lot is data as sunlight. In other words, it's non-exclusive. And so why do we think there's a special value just in that raw material? Sunlight helps plants to grow, but it doesn't, if it helps one plant, it doesn't stop it helping another plant. And that, I think, goes to Benno's point that it's in the use of the data that value is created. And I think it's very important for that element to be brought out. I also liked Priya's definition or comment that it's like a vote and it involves trust and so on. And that, I think, raises a question about how do you do a multi-stakeholder? And the nice thing about saying it's like a vote is that does mirror the idea that there are many, many hundreds of thousands, millions of people with a vote, and you can't actually organize them into a room other than through the political process, which leads to a government, and why should you have anything other than the government with businesses, in this case, that are being asked to control in a certain way? So that's one question. And then the other one is, in a way, maybe more fundamental. What is the problem that regulation is supposed to address? And I think people get very confused about that. Sometimes it's a sense that, well, there's something of value here and it's being stolen from people and taken out of the country and it ought not to be. And then you lead to data localization questions or to question about taxation and so on and so on. And then sometimes it's more specifically about privacy. And then I think it is more around data portability, transparency, and leaving it to people's, this goes to Dhanaraj's comment about the Indonesia question. Yes, I give away my data to all sorts of people and all sorts of institutions because it makes my life easier. I'm perfectly, I don't want somebody to say that can't happen. I want there to be a credit score for me. I want there to be online banking. And I think that we've got too tied up often in the sense that there is something bad about what's going on. And I think we should be more specific about what is the problem that any rules and regulations are seeking to address and try to focus it quite narrowly on those. Thanks.
Great. Yeah. So why don't we start with Caroline's great question, then we'll kind of work backwards through the rest, make sure we hit on everyone's.
I'm going to kind of address all of them at once. So I would just submit to you that I think that there's a lot of data science out there that has a different point of view than actually a lot of you have articulated. So those of us who've been working in data governance for a couple of decades have had to go through all of this. And multi-stakeholder, let's start with multi-stakeholder processes. They're very, very important because data is contextual. When you look at the data systems and you actually do the science of the data, It goes everywhere, but it's interconnected. You can't pull a chair out of this room and not affect the other chairs. So for example, you were talking about individual control of data in terms of you give your data and whatnot. But you know, the data systems are too large for that now. We have lost the ability to individually control or have meaningful impacts on all of the data systems around us. And therein lies the real problem in policy. So I would submit to you, it's not about regulation. It's not about control. It's about building institutions and mechanisms of trust. Why have you given your data away? It's because you trust that institution and the procedures in place. So sometimes regulations work. Sometimes ownership works, but sometimes also adaptive forms of governance work that are much more flexible, and it has to be taken in context. And this is why you need multi-stakeholder processes that are very robust, because if you look at the data ecosystems, you and I are part of the data ecosystems, we should have a vote at the table. So you create multi-stakeholders that are representative of certain categories of stakeholders. Government usually has the most, and also private businesses, commercials, both the public and the private sector. But there's also other experts. For example, if you're doing a health process, you're going to want to have private hospitals, you're going to want to have physicians, you'll want to have patient representatives, you'll want to have all the people who really have a dog in the race, if you will. So I do think that the vision of regulation is I think, I don't think it's something to be afraid of. It's not about regulation. It's about taking the tools that are, taking the arrows that are in the quiver and using the right arrow for the right situation. There used to be a real silver bullet approach of, and it's what the GDPR has done. This regulation will solve all of our data problems. No, actually, it just made them more complicated. So we find ourselves with this big law up here, which does have extraterritorial applicability, which is a huge problem for companies trying to do trade and economic trade. It is an economic barrier. It's a trade barrier, right? So putting that aside, what do you do on the ground? It's what you do on the ground that really matters. And you had made a question in regards to, you know, someone in Kenya wants to work, for example, in Sierra Leone. It doesn't, there is not necessarily, if you're protecting data in a way that mitigates risk for both the government and for groups of people and for individuals, for all of the stakeholders, it doesn't mean you're going to have regulation. You might have adaptive rules that they themselves have set up and created mutually. I think we need to look creatively at this and ensure that the goals are being met. But I don't see data as having a good use or a bad use. It simply has uses, and there's a huge, complex continuum of these uses. And we have to be careful because you can have good and bad uses simultaneously. It's so complicated. But I think that in a complicated world, we have to have a lot of solutions that are agreed upon mutually and have a lot of buy-in. I don't know if I touched enough on your question, but we can always talk later.
Yeah. I think, let me share my, my views as a former regulator, and partly because I think a lot of the data is being generated as an exhaust from the system of delivering and using services. And, you know, first you have to have the ability to collect that information, organize it, and make some good uses to it. In the regulatory world, I think it's more the question of risk assessment and trying to mitigate that risk. In dealing with anti-money laundering and terrorism in the financial world, there are global standards that have been set. We know they have been set at a level that probably addresses capabilities to deal with this set of questions in a very, very different type of level of development from a good number of where some of us are. And we made a big I think, pitch for proportionality, partly because we need to assess the type of risk at the levels of engagement and income and transactions, right? And appropriately develop solutions for that. So countries were required to do national risk assessments so that they can appropriately place their own levels of risk on what needs to be done in relation to the standards as sort of the vision. And I think similarly, it should be possible to do that also in this context. Yeah, we have to do that risk assessment as a starting point and be able to then design interventions and regulatory instruments that, you know, fits the situation. Yeah. It can't just be irrespective of. Yeah. Yeah.
Rather of you two, I know we still have a question hanging out on kind of technological solutions that might be of assistance in solving some of these problems.
So I was just going to touch, maybe not on that question, but
okay.
the other questions on the problem, which is good. What is, you know, we don't want to be trying to come up with policy solutions looking for a problem, but what is the issue here? And I think one of the issues is around trust, which everybody keeps talking about. There are people who are becoming more disenchanted, users who are becoming more disenchanted with their online experiences because of a range of issues around data breaches, harassment, doxing, all these kinds of things. Particularly like in the U.S., Pew has reported that there's declining trust in the internet in this country. Right, and so what's needed then is, you know, people like that will look for what kinds of protections do they have, what kind of recourse will they have, and that's where some elements of regulation will come in, whether through various kinds of authorities and so on. Half the world is actually offline, not using the internet. It's like almost 4 billion people. But when we think about when they start to come online, these issues that we're talking about now will actually grow exponentially, I think, in these bigger countries. And we will need to have some kind of ideas of how to continue those protections in those countries as well. On the point about regulation, as in trying to balance that excessive regulation with investments, attract companies. So I hear the point, and I appreciate that there is a need to get investment and get companies, you know, working in these countries, providing data services and so on. I would just kind of hesitate where we fall into this trap of having different standards around rights for data governance across different countries. So going back to the point made earlier, I think several of us have made that we should have some kind of uniformity there, and that should still enable investment and still should be able to attract investment. I think in the sense that where you have uniformity, it is an attraction for investors when you don't have to deal with different kinds of regulations, completely different regulations in different jurisdictions.
Priya, you.
Yeah, I guess, you know, when you talk about data, it's so easy to stay up in the ether around these risks and, you know, the erosion of the social compact and all this sort of stuff. You know, I'm more of a development person, so I think the reason I care about this is because, as Dhanaraj was saying, half the world is offline, and the next billion who come online, they're going to be people who are generating data as they interact with their mobile provider or bank, or, you know, however the data is getting generated. And the question is, how do you translate that into an asset that helps them improve their lives? So you might give your data away for free, and, you know, it's fine, but because it's not yours, you're not actually able to, and maybe you don't need it, you don't, you know, but in many parts of the world, to be able to take your data and be able to say to a bank, hey, I'm credit worthy, look at who my friends are, look at how I top up my mobile phone every week consistently, look at kind of who I am with this data, give me a loan, give me a job, give me a, you know, there's a lot of services that can be directly unlocked if you can prove who you are and kind of the behavior that you demonstrate and the responsibility you demonstrate. And I think that's real development, you know, impact right there. So we care about it because of these bigger issues, but I think there's a development angle that too often we're missing when we're talking about data governance. The other thing I'd say about, you know, the point around Sierra Leone is coherence across countries matters. Sierra Leone may not have the market heft to negotiate with big tech companies and be able to set in place a kind of privacy-heavy set of data regulations that's inconsistent with the rest of the world. But if you take Africa as a whole, soon the population will be larger than China. Half the population of Africa is under the age of 25. It's a thriving, continent that together represents a really powerful market bloc. So I think there's an opportunity to work across countries, maybe using the regional economic communities or something else to, establish what's the Africa data agenda that together can, have a little more negotiating power with tech companies. And lastly, just end with the private sector, of course, is important, but it doesn't kind of start and end with big tech. There are lots of small and medium enterprises, lots of other types of companies that can benefit from data. So establishing structures that expand the use of data, that open up data for more uses is great for the innovation economy. It's great for a variety of companies. And we don't need to just kind of be single-mindedly focused on, what will Google do if kind of thing.
So as a conscientious moderator, I don't want to leave a question stranded, so I'm going to try again. I'm surprised no one picked up the questions on technical, let's say not technological solutions, maybe technical solutions to how we can, what are ways we can drive down the cost of, or make regulation more efficient in this space, or the relationship between individuals and the companies, the platforms they're using. And I thought someone might take up the point on data fiduciaries, which is almost as open a concept as data governance is. No one did, but I thought I would try to tee it up to see if anyone does want to take that on.
So this is a question I'm asked about once a week right now in regards to legislation in the United States. So we had to work out a lot of, when we put out a policy, we've done research, it's fact-based. It's not just, rhetoric or theory. And I think it's really important to understand that the data fiduciary model is really difficult. And I'd like to see that model piloted somewhere, and then I'll have a much better ability to say, okay, let's see how this works. But
can you define the model for people that might be?
Data fiduciary, it depends on who you talk to in Congress right now. I think probably the most cohesive model I would say is Schatz right now, Senator Schatz. I would encourage you to look at the legislation. Does he have legislation printed out? If it's public yet, to take a look at that. If not, the conversation around data fiduciaries is that companies have a responsibility. Some of the proposed regulation puts extraordinary responsibility on the CEO, including potential criminal penalties when there is data misuse, et cetera. So one thing I wanted to bring up with every question is this. I think it's extraordinarily important that we move away from punitive approaches in terms of all of this governance. Strict liability approaches where you do something wrong and it's not a cycle of continual improvement, it's a cycle of punishment. And in the developing economies, you really want a cycle of improvement where you say, okay, you had a big data breach and guess what? There was a lot of fraud as a result of this and these people had stolen identities. How can we make this better for next time? Instead of, you did this, let's punish you and give you a huge fine that you can't afford and put you out of business. So I think we have to look at the punitive structure versus how do we make a continual process of improvement, more like the Demings, the cycle, et cetera. But in regard, let me take a shot at the institutionalization of this. I think there are many technical models for doing data governance and knowledge governance. And what model works is going to be dependent on the context that model is used in and the context of the entity that is managing and working with that model. And if the people within that jurisdiction want and use it and accept it, I think your idea of proportionality is absolutely essential. And I still think we need broad principles with adaptation according to the context that those are being used in. This exact same thing flows with technology. I don't like to think of technology as something completely different. It's just, it's like it's part of the tool set now. It's not, it's just a big part of it. it's hard to pull it apart as something separate.
Thanks. So I think we have time for one more round of questions, if anyone has any. Kevin?
Hi.
Anyone else?
Thank you. Kevin O'Neill from the Rockefeller Foundation. I wanted to ask about making the case for good data governance. I think to some degree in rooms like this, it's almost taken as a given. But what are the evidence? What is the state of the evidence? What are the carrots and sticks that can make those prime ministers and presidents care and those stakeholders care about this when they're facing a crowded development agenda with many pressing problems and in which data governance might be viewed as sand in the gears, or where they're seeing models of data use from China, from Tanzania, from wherever that are perhaps not the model of data governance, that are a model of data governance, but not the kind that we might want to see.
Thanks. That's a great question. David, and then Kyle, and I think we'll wrap up. And then one more, and we'll wrap up for questions.
David Medine, CGAP. There's been a lot of talk about global. G is not as global and cross-border. One example of data governance are data localization rules, which seem to restrict, they restrict data flow across borders, but they also restrict other things like sharing for counterterrorism efforts, for innovation, for bringing in outside players into the marketplace. What are your views about data localization as a form of governance? And if you oppose it, how do you convince governments that it's not in their long-term interest to adopt those types of rules?
Great. One here and then one.
So Kyle Navis, I work here at CGD. I'm curious, thinking about behavioral surplus. So much of the revenue made by tech companies and much of the consternation around them is coming out of their exploitation of the data exhaust. Should governments be using the behavioral surplus and the data that they're collecting on their citizens? Are there appropriate uses for that? Should there be limits? And who should be the one to maybe set those limits or be looking at them?
And then one more.
James Frameth, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Maybe as a corollary to the question from the back earlier, if there aren't models or technical solutions that we put forward as especially promising, are there specific areas that we would call out as kind of gaps or specific debates that we would highlight that need to be answered?
Okay, so Pri, why don't you respond to the first question and Pam to the last, and then we'll work on Kyle's question.
Yeah, so maybe, so Future State helped do the landscaping of over 100 digital policymakers, primarily in emerging markets earlier this year. Jonathan here led that research. When we asked the question, what are your kind of biggest priorities when it comes to data and technology, broadband and jobs and skills were the top two primary goals and concerns. The next two were data privacy and data sharing or data interoperability. So when we looked at the data at first glance, we were thinking, well, gosh, demand for issues of data governance are farther down the totem pole. When you add those two categories up around data sharing, data privacy, it actually, and just call that data governance, it suddenly jumps to the top of the list. All to say that, I think 2 years ago this was maybe still so new. Most digital 5-year digital plans don't talk very much about data governance. They might talk about cybersecurity, but really not kind of this issue of data interoperability and data privacy. But I think you'll see in the next set of 5-year plans, many of them more will. So I think demand is growing. What's also interesting from that study that we did was that when it comes to broadband needs and when it came to jobs and skills around technology, the request from policymakers was really clear. We need more financing, and and with the financing, we know what to do with it. When it came to the issues of data sharing, data privacy, it was all over the map, which is, I think, to say this is a new issue. The requests for support are not just financing, but it's really technical assistance, standard setting, more research, what are consent models that work? It's a whole range of things that people are asking for. So I think it's an issue that's only going to grow in importance and for which there is real demand.
So the roundtable is going to answer your question, so I'll address that there. Your question, I believe it was you, yes, that's a very intriguing question. Thank you for asking it. So we spent a lot of time on that question. So I'm going to give you a very specific use case answer because it'll just show you the way the fact pattern lays out, and I love a fact pattern. So are you familiar with Andhra Pradesh Real-Time Governance Center? Okay. So you've probably spent a lot of time on the Andhra Pradesh dashboard. If any of you are not familiar with the Andhra Pradesh Real-Time Governance Center, I recommend it to you to take a look at it. It's very important. Basically, they in India and Andhra Pradesh, the state. Actually, there's two now. It was split, but anyhow, there's two actually real-time governance centers. But what they've done is they've taken largely aggregate data, and they're using it to provide real-time statistics for anyone who cares to see it of what's happening in that jurisdiction, and it's quite extraordinary. In the developed world, it's quite similar to what FINRA is doing in a real-time way, for those who are familiar with it. So you asked about the touch points and the pain points of that. Really, it's not that it's there. That it's there is not a privacy problem. The pain point is, what does de-identification mean in this context, and can the data ever be re-identified, and what are the specific risks with that particular form and format of de-identification? And then the other risk and very serious pain point is, what are the rules around re-identifying data when there are problems that need to be solved? What are the procedural protections in place for that? And are there any legal protections in place? There may not be any legal protections. And where that is absent, you can create procedural protections and local rules that work. So I do think that that's a very good example. So the pain point with a lot of these real-time governance systems, and it exists elsewhere, is, what does de-identified mean? Is this a simple hash that takes this long to re-identify? Is it true de-identification where it cannot ever be re-identified? What is the decision? And that's actually a very difficult decision, because sometimes if there's let's say that there's a trouble spot where there's a lot of particular type of, perhaps there's a high murder rate in a jurisdiction or a little pocket. Well, maybe you want to dig down further into that, and maybe you want to get to a particular level of re-identification, maybe not to an individual level, but maybe a district level. What are the rules, and how can you prove that you've been following the rules to protect people? And then there were some other things mentioned, but I think we're running long, so I'm going to skip it and we can talk more.
Benno?
Yeah, I think we are just at the beginning of understanding these processes. The same way technology is just getting us into that space. Right? So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I think it's important to recognize that we cannot have all those answers, so to speak. But let me take only one of the questions, which is, why should policymakers care about this at all? When you look at a number of developing countries now, one thing that has caught their attention is this question of significant economic presence, which is not generating the revenue it should generate for the country concerned. So taxation issues have become really powerful, sort of, in the minds of policymakers, because that's one other part of the resource. Because given that revenue generation and incomes are moving more and more into that space. If you don't keep up with that, your tax base also will definitely have challenges to deal with. So that's one. Second, I think as these systems are coming up on the digital front, there are questions of security and questions of pilferage into the systems, which are really bothering authorities. And they feel they have the obligation to protect the citizens on that. So on the score of security, virtually, I don't think that's, you have a major task to get them to pay attention to. I think it's on the question of privacy and transparency in the political economy sense. They have an interest, but in the other way, depending on where they're positioned as far as transparency and related issues are concerned. But I should add, I think increasingly, with all these little pilots which are providing solutions for health questions, education questions, etc., all of them using and applying data. I think the value is being seen from that developmentally. And that's where the question of the trade-off with privacy and security actually comes through. I don't know, sir, I just thought I would describe putting myself exactly where most of these policymakers now are. Yeah, but they're just at the beginning of that. To understand and to get a good sense of what they need to be able to govern in all those senses, I think is still a long journey.
Dhanaraj, you get the last word.
Sure. So the question about innovations, I think we kind of addressed. Pam talked about fiduciaries. There's issues around data collaboratives, data trusts, which are all new, worth researching and understanding more. Data portability, like Future State had a great seminar on that. These are all new issues. What I think, for me, the question that came out is around, why, what's the use case for data governance? I think comes back to is really important. So to kind of complement what Ben said in his response to that, I would maybe spin it back to what you had originally started with. What's the relevance to practitioners in the development space. And when you look at ICT for the information communication technology for development, there's an emphasis on technological solutions to development problems, but in reality, ICT for D, as the definition states, is really meant to address information and communication problems, not political, social, institutional problems. In my mind, this is where data governance can really increase the efficacy of ICT for D, because we can address issues around privacy, data protection, but also improving the rights and protecting people's rights in the application of these technical solutions. So I see that coming in as strengthening ICT for D, who, and I've been involved in it, we often get kind of too focused on technical solutions solving everything when we know that's not the reality. But here is an opportunity then for data governance. And so in responding to the people have asked, I think that is something that's one way we can look on it.
Great, thanks. So thank you all the panelists. It was really an excellent discussion, I think. And I think I'm going to steal a line that Priya said to me yesterday, that you can't distinguish between or differentiate between data governance and governance more broadly. And that's one of my big takeaways from this panel. And the second is the idea of the messy middle. I found the conversation, I'm nowhere closer on any answers for any of these things, but I think I found it clarifying enough that my next round of questions will be better. So, and I hope you and the audience are kind of left in a similar place. So thank you very much, panelists, and thank you, audience.
Thank you.
Good.